So even as a young man, as a kid, I can remember going into the audio stores of those days and I didn't even have to hear the music. I really just wanted to look at the gear, touch it, turn the knobs. I was a little, yeah, I was always a very cautious kid, and I was never the guy that went in and turned it up just to see how high you could get it before I got some attention. I literally hardly ever touched and turned anything unless it was off and I felt like I wasn't going to disturb anybody. But for me, it was the aesthetic of this gear. As early as tube era gear, I remember my grandparents having tube era gear, and I remember climbing behind the TV and watching the little glow of those tubes, and it was fascinating how that turned into this sound, that came out. Now, I wasn't ever the engineering type where I wanted to, tear into it, and I wasn't that curious, but I always loved the industrial design. And every year that they would come out, I was a subscriber as a young man, a subscriber to the audio magazines, and I was consuming it visually first. And so that aspect never left. And I've always admired the gear from the 50s all the way through to today because I'm sort of acutely aware of how much effort it went into that design. Some are better than others, but they all had a perspective. And I've always thought of the amount of time and energy it took someone, or not even someone, but a group of people to put it together. And that's one of the things, and one of the reasons I set up my personal showroom here is that I enjoy looking at it. I do. I get a great satisfaction out of just turning around, and I'll focus on a single piece and think through it a little bit. Some aspects, how do they, came up with that interface, or why did they put that knob on this side versus the other side, and compare it to others. And it's just something I've always done. And I admired all those aspects of it from a very young age. So now, now that I have, it's the same as comic books in a way. When I collected comic books, there were certain periods of comic books. They went through phases and they went through storylines. And when you get to see the big picture of 20, 30 years of development or writing, then you can put storylines together in a way that you probably couldn't do in real time when they were coming out. So that's part of what I enjoy now. And in fact, I've oftentimes what I spend a little mental energy on is going through some of the design changes that some of the lines went through. And I'm sort of, surprised on occasion that, for example, Macintosh didn't change a lot over the decades. Marantz stuck with a design for the entire 70s. Their design aesthetic hardly changed at all, where you have Sansui, who went through several iterations of model lines that changed dramatically over the time frame. From the beginning of the 70s to the end of the 70s, you can barely tell that they're from the same company, if at all. Other than the name, you hardly would suspect it was from the same company. And most, I think, of the very active manufacturers, I think, did that. Technics was sort of, had a lineage that was fairly noticeably similar. Yamaha, the same thing. There were more subtle changes. Sansui, I think, maybe had some of the most dramatic. Pioneer had some fairly dramatic changes, from their blue face to the more silver face. But I find it all quite interesting, and it's one of the things that makes me interested in that other piece. I don't really focus on, is it the biggest all the time? Mostly what I focus on is, do I have a representative piece from that line? I know a lot of people are obsessed with having just all of the biggest ones, and that's a nice thing, but I have enough of them to tell you that it's quite challenging just to move them around. And I'm perfectly satisfied with, I'll say middle of the road and higher. I don't want to get the smallest one because it's missing features, but I'm typically fine with, sort of the mid range to the upper mid range of an example. But for me, they covered that period of that manufacturer, and you can compare them together and see what they were trying to achieve and what the design aesthetic was during that period of time. Quite an interesting period going from the tube era into the early solid state era. And I imagine it was a pretty interesting time for manufacturers. The units, for most of them, didn't change dramatically. From around 1964 to 67, 68, most of the models still look very similar. They still slid their units into the same kind of cabinet in many cases. The look of them didn't change dramatically. It was around 69, 70, 71, most of them took on some different looks. There were still a lot of sort of that gold faced front faceplate still carried over, and it was a gradual change. And then the 70s, it suddenly, we went from literally the gold face to the silver face in a big way. And then into the 80s, of course, it changed into the black face and digital interface and digital screens and those sorts of things. But to me, they all represent a period of time, and you can, most of the time, look at something and say, yeah, that's early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, or that's late 70s time frame, and 80s, and so of course early 60s. But most of the time, I think you can identify them relatively close. The one that I find the hardest is Marantz and Macintosh. Macintosh I find very difficult too. I have to see the numbers on Macintosh because to me they're first off, you have to be up close because of the dark mirrored fronts, glass fronts. But Macintosh, Marantz, it took me some time to realize that the nomenclature of them didn't indicate when they were made, and it's quite interesting. There were very early on, I thought the 70, 45, 65, 75, etc. were similar to how Sansui would manufacture theirs, and that they were typically in time frames, but that's not the case at all. And I found it quite interesting when I figured out that a 45 was made in a different time frame than the 2275, for example. And that was some interesting sort of realization that I had compared to, again, Sansui. I think Sansui is the perfect example of the manufacturer who was, at least in the late 60s through the early 80s, was very much hitting on all cylinders. They were not afraid to change their designs, go in a new direction, and try something new. Marantz stayed the same the entire decade, and of course, it seems to have worked out well for them. They have a lot of very collectible models. All of the models from the 70s pretty much are collectible and sought after. Same for Sansui, but a little slightly different. I think you have fans for different eras, and because there is part of that is the design looks so different. The 8 looks quite different from the G models, for example, and there's, hard to say that they are from the same company. Well, let's get up close and personal with the Marantz line. So I put some little signs here below each one to designate what years was the specific model manufactured. So I'm going to start up here on the left. This is the 22, and this is considered, I think, the first solid state model receiver that they came out with. And right out of the gate, they sort of nailed it, the design aesthetic. Now, did they know they were going to carry this whole aesthetic through a whole year? Through a whole decade? I doubt it. But once the sales started coming in, I'm sure they decided, well, we've got a winner here. Slightly down, I don't see another unit with this little antenna tuning button after this. But other than that, the buttons and the knobs are all the same through the entire 70s. You've got the horizontal tuning dial here, which set them apart from everyone else. And they continued this for each release. So next to it, I've got a 2245. These were made from 71 to 73. Slightly bigger, dial face here. That's still that blue background that I'm very familiar with. Coming on down, let's see, I'm going to go over here to the left. So this is a 2235, and these were 75, 76, and there you go. Same thing, same design, same pretty much, interface. Very subtle differences. Maybe, as far as I can tell, looking at the two, the phone connection, headphone connection might be a little bit different, and that's about it. The buttons are the same, things like that. So still carrying it over. Here's the 4430. Now this is a quad unit. These were made from 73 to 78. So it took us pretty much to the end of the decade, and no changes here. I think that says a lot about the success of the very early design of Marantz. And you certainly can tell a Marantz from well across the room. So here is a 2275, and these were from 74 to 76. Pretty cool. So that's Marantz pretty much for the whole decade here. Now, of course, some are going to point out that they had some B models which had, that silver face and the dial and things. I have an example or two. I've got a 2500. I just didn't feel like lugging it out here. It's rather much a beast. I'll do that in a future separate video though. All right, so let's contrast the Marantz with Sansui. I did the same thing. I took several models and I put the years of manufacture underneath them. So let's start off on the top right here. And this is the 8. You got the 8 and you got the 8 Deluxe, but they were pretty much manufactured from the same time frame. This time from 71 to 75 is for both, but they both look very similar. They have sort of this kind of dark top tuner dial section, and then this very chromed out bottom row here. And this was what Sansui's offering looked like in this time frame. Now the difference in Sansui also is that their models typically overlapped. So the 8 and 8 Deluxe ran from 71 to 75, but then as an overlap, they also had the 881, the 771, 661 model line as well. And similar looking, they have changed some things here, but these ran from 74 to 76. So it's a bit of a departure, slight. It's I'll say incremental, change. And we're going to come down, and we went to the XO line, model line. This is the 9090, and the 9090 DB is right below it. And both of these ran from the 75 to 79 range. So they ran from the latter part of the decade of the 70s. So you had this model line running, and at the same time, out came the G series. Now this is the G6000, but of course, it had an entire series. I think it went from the 2 all the way to the 9. And these were 78 to 80. So we went into, end of the decade with a lot more bling here, I'll say. And of course, there were some other models that, the model line after this was the X700 series. So that's the 7700, 8700, 9700. And for a period of time, there were some, 55, 6500 model line as well. They sort of came in between and overlapped them. I don't tend to see those as often. So that's a bit of a look at the difference between Marantz and Sansui, but again, back to the aesthetic, it's a look and feel that I appreciate for each one. Sansui was going through lots of iterations, coming out with whole new model lines, changing up that aesthetic, and I like all of them for different reasons. Marantz, they hit it right out of the gate. They decided that was the look and style that they wanted to maintain, and they just came out with basically new models with new, power levels for the most part, and maybe some tweaks here, but they didn't change the form factor, the knobs, everything sort of stayed the same through the whole decade. But luckily they hit a home run on that, and it was appealing for the entire decade. And went completely in a different direction in the 80s. Quite a departure. The 80s Marantzes, some of them I thought were a bit on the tacky side, but I don't have any of those as an example. But boy, they really did well in the 70s. And if you pick a good design, means it'll stand the test of time if you do it right. Well, a little bit of a different video this week. Hope you like this. I thought I would try some different type of format and see how that worked. I've been looking at some other videos and getting some ideas in completely different industries, and just trying to get a feel for how I might do some videos in the future and how I might format them. So let me know what you think about this format, and sure, it won't be exactly the same, but maybe I'll keep some aspects of it. But anyway, if you don't want to miss the next video, hit subscribe. Want to get notified, hit that bell. And as always, thank you guys so much for tuning in.